Good morning, everybody. Back with you again on a Saturday, and a big day for me as I'm doing a wedding. My son Eric and his fiancee Angelina are going to be married this afternoon. So I wanted to get this in early this morning and upload it so you can be blessed by it. Today we're going to pick up on Genesis chapter 4, which is the story of Cain and Abel. We left off with Adam and Eve being driven out of the Garden of Eden by the Lord and angels there with flaming swords, making sure that they could not get back into the garden and partake of the tree of life, which would forever have damned them. So we pick up now in chapter 4, and we have Adam and Eve. It says the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. Again, she gave birth to his brother Abel. And it says, Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. Cain became very angry and his countenance fell. Obviously some time goes by here because they're probably at least late teens, early young adult age. And we see Cain is a farmer and Abel is a shepherd, basically. He's got lambs, sheep, it says firstlings of the flock. Here is the first act of premeditated murder in the earth. Remember I said Genesis is a book of beginnings. This is the first murder. And from this we see that the reason why Cain's offering was not accepted, you have to go back to chapter 3, verse 17, where God says to Adam, cursed is the ground because of you, disobedience. In toil you eat of it all the days of your life. Did Cain know this? I'm sure Adam might have, well, I'm not sure, but I would surmise Adam told the story of how he and Cain's mother fell into disobedience, sinned, and were cast out of the garden from God's presence. So Cain bringing this offering of the ground is cursed, and the Lord has no regard for it. However, Abel's offering is accepted. Why? Because it cost something. There was blood involved. And Cain's offering, it has no value. Some people see in this the whole idea of redemption versus works. And I would agree with that. Redemption, obviously the blood of the Lamb, Christ. We come under his blood to receive forgiveness of sins, salvation, and we become heirs of righteousness. Cain is, a tiller of the ground. It's his works that are seemingly trying to be presented to God as something worthwhile for acceptance. Our works, we try to do all kinds of good things in relation to maybe sins, and we think, we're going to be all right here. No, the blood is what the Lord is looking for. It says in Leviticus, the life of the flesh is in the blood. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins, as it says in Hebrews. So, this is what happens. And Cain rises up and kills his brother Abel, as it says in verse 8, 7 and 8. And the Lord calls him out on it. Where's your brother? It tells me that the blood of Abel, as it says in verse 10, is crying to the Lord from the ground. Isn't that interesting? Blood is not going to be, the earth is not going to receive and cover over innocent blood. That's what it's saying here. And Cain is cursed. Even though his life is spared, he becomes a wanderer, an exile. the Lord puts some kind of a sign on him so other people eventually, as they are born and developed, will not kill him. They won't slay him. So this is the story of Cain and Abel. And, fruit is not going to be accepted in this situation. It's like bad fruit. It's cursed. The descendants now come into play. And again, time goes by here. We see, I've got to bring this out, in verse 17, Cain had relations with his wife. After he leaves Adam and Eve, she conceives and gives birth to Enoch. Where did that come from? Again, there had to be siblings born as well. It's not just Cain, Abel, and then we jump to Seth. It tells me here there were no other people. So there is a sense of a sibling. And Cain has relations with this sister. It says it's his wife here, so he brings her alongside, and she gives birth to Enoch. Then the descendants are forming. We have Lamech in verse 19, who takes 2 wives to himself. So here's the introduction of polygamy. And then it says a little bit of a summary of what these children become. Some are farmers in verse 20, they have livestock. Others are musicians in verse 21. And then others are forgers of implements of bronze and iron, so they are metal workers. Not a lot said here in terms of who these people were, but they are the descendants of Cain. And then we get over to verse 25. It says Adam had relations with his wife again. Okay, I don't think the again is Cain and Abel. I think it's this other sister that Cain takes as a wife, and then other people as well, like Lamech and all of them, although he's born from Cain's descendants. And Eve gives birth to a son, names him Seth, for she said, God has appointed me another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain killed him. Notice in all of these descendants, there is no indication that they had any fellowship with God. Until verse 26, Seth has a son called Enosh. And then it says men began to call upon the name of the Lord, which indicates to me that there's fellowship with God again. So now you've got 2 lines here. Adam and Eve lived to be about 930 years old, if you can believe that. They lived to see Enoch born. We'll get to him in a minute. And Seth takes Abel's place in the righteous line. There's 2 families. There's the descendants of Seth, and then there's the descendants of Cain. One piece about Enoch here. Some scholars disagree on whether this is the Enoch in chapter 5 that is translated. It says in verse 24, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Some time had gone by. Was it more than 65 years after all these generations here? It would appear so, although it can't be proven. And then it says he was translated. He was caught up. He was raptured, if you will. Implication. So Enoch is targeted here by God for fellowship, and even more, a covenant, just like Adam was before the fall. He is someone God wanted to be with him. The rest of chapter 5 is, again, genealogy of different people. And then we get to chapter 6, which is very interesting. Now, scholars believe there was about 1,656 years from creation to the flood. I'd like to know how they got that down to the year. I've heard it was like 2,000 years, which is a rounding off of the years, but they say, in my research, 1,656 years. Now we got something very interesting. Look at, well, I'll start with 1 for context. It came about when men began to multiply on the earth, daughters were born to them. that the sons of God saw the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. And the next verse, the Lord says, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. That comes in a process of time, because you're going to see other people exceed that for a while. Now, why is this interesting? Again, there's a controversy here, or a difference of interpretations. Some people say the sons of God are fallen angels, and they get that from Job chapter 1 and chapter 2, where it says the sons of God, definitely a reference to angels, and Satan with them appear before the court of the Lord in heaven. Daniel chapter 3, verse 25 is another reference with the Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and there's a fourth in there, a son of the gods, and we believe that was Jesus. So some scholars say this was fallen angels, and you see here in verse 4, Nephilim, giants, were on the earth in those days when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and bore children to them. That's the offspring. Fallen angels, earthly women, Nephilim, giants. However, other scholars interpret this as the sons of God are the descendants of Seth. And the reason they say that is Matthew 22 and verse 30, where Jesus is talking about how angels in heaven are going to be different than people on the earth. He's implying that there is no sexual capability. You can look that up. I don't want to really turn there at this point. So you decide. I tend to think it was the first one, that there were giants on the earth because fallen angels took women. Can't really be proved per se. I mean, this other interpretation, a lot of well-known scholars adhere to that one. But where did the Nephilim come from? I think it was from the sons of God, which were fallen angels. All right, enough of that. We get to Noah later in chapter 6. He's introduced here. And it says, he found favor in the eyes of God, of the Lord. Isn't that interesting? How would you like to have that on your resume? Found favor in the eyes of the Lord. He becomes the father of 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth is going to be destroyed. Judgment is coming. It's imperative. And God says, begin to create an ark. Now, the ark is not a boat like some people think. It's more of a floating barge. Can't steer it, can't direct it. And the water begins to come on the earth, because in verse 12 it says, God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. All flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. He says, I'm about to destroy the whole earth. All right? And then he tells them about how to make the ark. A lot of rain. And he's also got animals in the ark as well. A lot of rain comes down, 40 days, 40 nights. That is one of the sources of the heavy rains of the water. Also, there were subterranean waters under the earth that get the ground saturated, and before long, the water just rises, and people are destroyed. Wickedness, disobedience, rebellion, corruption. Now we're looking at the recreation of man through Noah. We have 3 sons here, and I want to touch on them briefly. Shem, in verse, let's go to, let me just say this. The flood subsides, and I don't really want to get into that a whole lot, but we've got it landing on what many people believe is Mount Ararat in Armenia. It's 17,000 feet above sea level, so eventually the waters descend and the ark lands on this mountain. So now we got the 3 sons here. Shem, as it says in chapter 9 of verse 26. Noah is blessing his sons. It's also cursing one of them. We'll get to that in a minute. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Have you ever heard the word anti-Semite? Against Jewishness? This is from Shem, not the anti, the Semite. He settles lands in the Middle East. The God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. So it seems like Shem and Japheth adhere to the whole order of having a relationship with God. The blessing indicates that he accepted the knowledge of Yahweh from his father. Japheth also enters into this as well. However, Ham does something despicable. Noah gets drunk, the fruit of the vine. He's laying naked inside his tent. He's uncovered. Verse 21, I'm reading in Genesis 9. Ham, who becomes the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Shem and Japheth take a garment laid upon both their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned away so that they did not see his father's nakedness. Noah awoke from the wine. He knew what his younger son had done. He says, "Cursed be Canaan, not Ham, the son and the descendants. He shall be a servant of servants. He shall be to his brothers." And then it says Noah lives to be 950 years old and he dies. You might say, well, that's pretty unfair. Noah's grandson gets cursed for something the father did. That's what it says. Other people want to read some things into that with this. I don't really want to touch on that. But the last thing I want to mention here is the three sons, again, are people who settle nations. Japheth, for one, goes up to the north, and that is the European countries. Shem to the Middle East. Ham, it's been told, was going south into the African nations. Cush is an ancient name for Africa. That was one of the sons of Ham. And we see that, various things happen here with these men and their descendants. Again, a lot of genealogies in here. I'm not going to go over all of that. We're going to come to a man named Nimrod in chapter 10, verse 9. It says, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. His father was Cush, whose father was Ham. And the beginning of his kingdom, Nimrod, was Babel and Erech and Akkad, Cana in the land of Shinar. We're going to get to the Tower of Babel next week. Just one last thing on Nimrod. A lot of scholars believe he was somewhat of an occultist. He was somebody who dealt with astrology, idolatry. The Babylonian system is basically what came out of him. And because of that, the Tower of Babel is going to be, or attempted to be, erected. But that's for another lesson. And we see here that Nimrod could have been the ringleader of the whole Tower of Babel. It says in verse 10, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, which means confusion. So we're going to leave off with that. I gave you a lot to chew on. So if you think of it, you're watching this morning or this afternoon, pray for me for this wedding. Thank God, beautiful day, very nice weather. So we're going to get the last child married today. Have a great day. We'll see you next week. We'll pick up with the Tower of Babel.